So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's NCVER webinar on the topic of skills anticipation systems and their role in informing new qualifications and competencies in VET. My name is Phil Loveter. I'm the Executive Manager Inform and Engage at NCVER, and it's my privilege today to be presenting to you. And just a reminder that we will be recording today's proceedings, which will be made available on the NCVER portal shortly. I'm aware that some of our colleagues from UNESCO UNIVOC based in Europe might be with us today, and it's very, very early in the morning there, so some of them might actually want to see the recording afterwards, so we will definitely be recording. Oh, okay, can you show me how? We seem to have a problem. It's not sharing. Okay, yep, share. Okay. Just click on this. Yeah. Okay, no worries. My apologies. It seems that the sharing suddenly stopped, so we've just fixed that. So hopefully everything's okay. So today we're using the platform Zoom. For those who aren't familiar with the platform, I'll just briefly explain some of the components. You can see this is an image of the Zoom control panel where you can select audio mode and ask questions, and you can check your audio settings on the left and submit any questions throughout the webinar through the Q&A section as highlighted in the left screen. And for privacy reasons, only we can see your question. And we'll acknowledge all questions and comments submitted via the questions panel, either directly during the webinar today in the Q&A session, or of course afterwards via the email. We'll make sure that we get back to you with an answer. Firstly, though, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continued spiritual connection to land. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I'm meeting from Kaurna land here in Adelaide, South Australia with you all today, and welcome to any First Nations people who are joining us today. Okay, let's get into it then. What I want to do is talk a little bit about a project that NCVER was fortunate enough to be involved in with several different partners, but ultimately under the guidance of the United Nations Education, Science and Cultural Organisation BUILT project, Bridging Innovation and Learning in TVET project. And so I'll talk a little bit about why it's important. And then I want to introduce a concept, which is their framework for developing new qualifications and competencies. They call it TVET, we call it VET here in Australia, but TVET being Technical, Vocational Education and Training, and introduce the concept of the 3 I's and the 3 M's. For this presentation in particular, I want to focus in particular on the first of the 3 I's, but I will mention the others as well. And then I want to finish with some challenges and tips to these sorts of processes. So firstly, the BUILT project is a program of UNESCO. It's run out of the UNESCO UNIVOC International Centre for TVET based in Bonn, Germany. And it really aims to assist vocational education systems to better identify, integrate and implement new qualifications and competencies in the most effective learning settings. The presentation that I'm going to give you today very much draws on some of the work that we were involved in as an organisation, engaged with UNESCO, but also working with other partners. And you can see underneath there's 3 different publications, and I've also got the URL there to the BUILT micro website on the UNESCO UNIVOC website, which gives you lots and lots of information around the approach, the projects, but also a whole range of resources and things such as that for those that are actually engaged in the process of implementing new qualifications and competencies. The one on the left, which is volume 1 around TVET governance, steering collective action, was the one that NCVER was involved in, very much at the sort of system macro level. We were working closely with CEREC, based in France, who handled the MISO level, which is ensuring that multiple stakeholders participate actively in the process. And then the final one on the right, the orange covered one, was providing innovative solutions, and that was handled by our colleagues at JET Education Services based in Johannesburg in South Africa. And down at the bottom left, you can see that this project and initiative was supported financially through the UNESCO International Centre for Vocational Education Research. UNESCO were the main coordinators of the overall program, so the UNESCO Univoc Centre in Bonn. Also, it was supported by the German government, both the Federal Institute for Vocational Education and Training and the Federal Ministry of Education and Research. So the German government was the main funder of this. So VET's role and need to respond. So looking at the research, especially the research around that UNESCO has undertaken, is that arguably our system, the vocational education and training system, is probably one of the closest to the labour market. It plays a really important role in terms of providing skilled labour, in helping young people to make that transition from school to work, but also in ensuring that we can reskill and upskill individuals. Vocational education and training needs then to respond to both current and future economic challenges. It's clear that things change very, very quickly. We need to worry about what are the skills that people need now, but increasingly we need to worry about and understand what are the skills that people need going forward. The BUILT project, through its research, identified things like accelerating digital technology innovations, new demands in green skills, sustainability, environmental protection, and systems of migration and things such as that as major factors in terms of driving the importance of rethinking NQC and understanding what they are. And I think these drivers align very closely to our own circumstances here in Australia. For example, the Australian government's employment white paper identified some of these factors as ones that are likely to impact on employment going forward. Issues around an ageing population, the rising demand for care and support services, the perennial technology and digital transformation needs, climate change, and also the net zero transformation agenda, but also increasingly geopolitical risk and fragmentation. So what are the 3 I's in the BUILT framework? And I'll show you a map in a moment. But essentially the 3 I's indicate the 3 levels that these things can be considered at. Firstly, there's identification. So what are the provisions for identifying relevant new qualifications and competencies? Then there's integration. What are the procedures for integrating this into curricula and also into national standard setting? And then finally, implementation. So what are the ways that NQCs can be implemented in a classroom setting, including innovative teaching and learning practices? And the framework is applied to all contributions of all stakeholders that are involved in the different levels of identifying the need for new qualifications and competencies. Then additionally, I've added the 3 M's. So the stakeholder contributions at these different levels can be considered at the macro level. These are usually considered to be governance level. They're the ones that are involved in steering collective action. They are often involving ministries, departments, statutory bodies, regulators, things such as that. And they're often the ones that are tasked with kind of establishing the environment for NQC to be kind of considered and developed. Then there's a middle level, which is the MESO level. It's usually defined as an advocacy level. So ensuring that the multiple stakeholders in our vocational education and training system, which of course comprises industry, providers, trade unions, research institutions, and others, have an opportunity to influence what's going on in terms of NQC. And then at the micro level, this is normally defined as the delivery level. So what are the sorts of innovative solutions that can be used by practitioners on the ground or within training providers themselves to ensure that the NQCs are understood and that they're in a good position to be able to translate them into training products and content on the ground. This here is a map taken from the UNESCO Univoc built website. So basically what it does is it just clarifies what I mentioned previously in my previous slides. You can see across the top the NQC process involving identification, integration, implementation. Then down the left-hand side, they're the different stakeholders, macro, meso, and micro, and that the contribution of all of these respective stakeholders ensures that we maintain a responsive and agile system that can actually deal with the increasing speed with which we need to actually address new qualifications and competencies. So the first step, and the one that NCVER was most involved in, was very much around the first step, which was around identification. So issues around understanding labour supply and demand. So the first step in the process is very much identifying current and future skills needs in the labour market. Again, this identification can happen at all three levels. It involves lots of different approaches. So, and using that same pattern of explanation at the macro level. These sorts of approaches might involve things like skills observatories, stakeholder surveys, major industry projects, etc. Examples at the meso level might involve things like AI-based learning experience platforms, analytics, things such as that. And examples at the micro level are very much around feedback, labour market, using labour market data, helping to identify current and potential skills supplies, monitoring enrolment patterns and data collected through student and/or market surveys. The one thing I will say, though, is that it's impossible really to categorically say that there are different types of data that only get used by macro, meso, or micro level stakeholders. That I'll talk a little bit more about the nature of that sort of data. And quite often we see multiple different stakeholders using that sort of data, although some tends to dominate amongst the different groups. So a range of different approaches are used to understanding skills from prospective studies. Trying to kind of predict, looking at things like, megatrends and things such as that, right through to stakeholder consultation, analysis of skills and careers information. And what we've seen is that skills anticipation and labour market information observatories, as they're often called, are being developed right across the world to determine where governments, for instance, should invest in NQC, where providers should put their efforts, and really where we might, for instance, put our skilled migration strategies together and things such as that. And most countries are starting to make some traction towards that, and Australia is no different. So what are skills anticipation systems? Well, I've got a couple of explanations there. One that I got from the International Labour Organization, which basically states that skills anticipation itself is actually a strategic and systematic process through which labour market actors identify and prepare to meet future skill needs, thus helping to avoid potential gaps between skills demand and supply. While CEDAFOP in 2018 indicated that a skills anticipation system is a type of technology or methodology used to predict and identify the skills that will be needed in the future, especially in the context of employment and workforce development. So just a couple of definitions of what we're talking about. Why have them? I think I've listed 5 key reasons why they're important. Firstly, they provide insights into the skills that are required in a contemporary workforce. So they very much can identify what's important now and also start to give us some hints about what's emerging. They form the basis of the development of new qualifications and competencies, and often even things like micro-credentials in both our sector, VET, and also in higher education. They can be useful in terms of informing updates to qualifications and to licensing conditions, especially in industry occupations and especially in regulated industries. They can be useful in identifying the extent to which new occupations are emerging, especially resulting from some sort of a technology change, but also the introduction of kind of new thinking and consumer preferences and things such as that. And I'm thinking here in particular around sort of greening and especially around the introduction of new technologies such as green plumbing and things such as that. And also they're very valuable to policymakers and industry because they provide that sort of evidence that they can use to agree on training solutions and continue to implement these. So very, very useful in terms of assisting in government purchasing of training and things such as that. It gives them valuable information of where the likely need for skills is going to fall. How do they work? Again, there's 5 different ways that skills anticipation systems work and that they can contribute. Firstly, data collection. So systems gather data from various sources, including labour market trends, job postings, industry reports, educational outcomes. And quite often through things like data linkage, we're seeing other data sources being brought in too to assist in trying to understand the supply and demand equation. Then through analysis. So the analysis can use techniques like machine learning, statistical analysis, natural language processing to identify patterns and predict future skill requirements. Forecasting, very much used to understand the demand for the future. This can include looking even at things like specific technical skills, soft skills, or a combination of both. Then recommendations. So, this sort of information through skills anticipation can help to make recommendation on training programs, educational curricula, pathways, and aligning our training system with assessed future needs and things such as that. And also these sorts of systems are valuable in terms of ongoing monitoring and updating to ensure that the system stays relevant, that it continuously monitors new data, that it updates its forecast to reflect changes in technology, industry practices, economic conditions, and so forth. And we're starting to see that in many, many countries across the world. So broadly, what are some examples of skills anticipation systems? I mentioned already skills observatories. There's skills and employment data modelling, stakeholder engagement and employer surveys, job vacancy analysis, including internet job vacancy scraping, leveraging jobs and career databases, forecasting and modelling, and cross-sectoral projects. And I think the one thing I'll say is that not one example usually provides the full picture, that most holistic models actually make good use of a multiplicity of different elements of skills anticipation to arrive at the most accurate or best predictions that they can. So skills observatories, just a few examples of skills observatories that are operating around the world. I'm not going to go into them in any great detail other than to recognise them. I mean, clearly the labour market information system in Europe, our own labour market insights, which is managed through Jobs and Skills Australia, was formerly the LMIP, is an example of one operating here. Brazil, for instance, through its National Service for Industrial Training has one. One of the probably earliest examples of one of these sorts of things was ONET Online, and a lot of the sorts of skills classifications and skills observatories that have followed have used the American example, to actually develop their own. And also more recently, CEDAFOP, based in Thessaloniki in Europe, has been working on one called OVATE. So some examples of macro level skills observatories that are operating around the world. Going into just a little bit more detail about modelling and forecasting, these tend to use selected economic, educational, labour market, demographic information, and they're intended to make a good fist of predicting skills supply and demand, looking at issues around skills mismatch, skills development, and again, as mentioned earlier, quite often using data linkage, so not relying on any one particular data set, but using multiple data sets. Again, they can involve things like additional scraping of other insights, like the Burning Glass Institute Labour Insights data. Internet job vacancy information can be a valuable source of understanding what are some of the kind of new skills needs that are starting to emerge, and are quite often built into the sorts of modelling and forecasting that different agencies do. Then there's the development of integrated data sets, combining information on education skills especially with other things like health, taxation, and social data. And this has increasingly been a priority. And I think one where Australia actually has been really active and showing quite a bit of leadership in terms of developing integrated data assets that can be used to kind of more accurately predict these sorts of things for a whole range of purposes. Looking at from the Australian perspective then, I've tried to define some data sources that are useful for especially the macro and meso level. So these are organisations or agencies that are seeking relatively high-level information on skills supply and demand. They might need that to do things like to support training purchasing decisions, to provide targets on training and trends. They can be used for things like, skills and demand lists and things such as that. And the type of institution at the sort of macro and meso level might include, for instance, government ministries or departments of training authorities themselves, regulators, statutory bodies, statistical agencies and custodians, but also increasingly industry and provider bodies, like the Jobs and Skills Councils, but also training providers. And the types of data, I've just listed a few. I do stress that this is not an absolutely exhaustive list, but the ADS person level integrated data asset PLIDA is an example of one where a whole range of different data custodians have made, especially national data custodians, have made their data available to allow deeper insights to be gained. The Business Longitudinal Analysis Data Environment, BLADE. I think a lot of us have heard of the VET National Data Asset, VANDA. But also there's work that we do ourselves here at NCVER, like VET Pathways and Outcomes Analysis and things such as that. And collectively, all of this sort of data is particularly useful, I think, in trying to understand these sorts of trends. Then we've got the National VET Data. NCVER, of course, is the custodian of the National VET Data. So some of our data, like student enrolment data, our apprentice and trainee data, student results, survey responses through our national surveys, but also our funding collection data. All of those sorts of things can be useful in terms of understanding some of these things. And then, of course, we've got employment data, especially from Jobs and Skills Australia and the ABS, including things like labour accounts, job mobility, job vacancies, employment, and employment projections, employer recruitment experience, skills classifications and taxonomy and the sort that are managed through Jobs and Skills Australia. So an example of the sorts of data sources that are available to be interrogated for these sorts of things at the sort of high level and the middle level. In terms of the micro level, that some will use some of that data, but often at the micro level, we're often talking about students. We're sometimes talking about influencers, people like parents or those that are involved in the career advice industry. We've, I think, as a country, I think we've always been quite active in providing information for students and potential prospective clients of the system to understand what are the sorts of careers for them and what are the sort of training options for them. So career databases such as My Future, My Careers, things such as that. The demands of students and their industry partners and where they're located. So, students can interrogate these sorts of things to understand what sorts of jobs they might be interested or families of jobs, but also understand, what are the sort of training options in their particular geographic region and things such as that. And for providers, there's additional data as well, like NCVER's RTO Data Hub, which can be useful in terms of providers understanding their own hinterland and kind of understanding their own sort of demand side factors, and also, of course, the NCVER Student Outcome Survey. So again, not meant to be absolutely exhaustive, but some examples of, the sorts of data that are available at the sort of levels that we've been talking about. So that was data. Additionally, there's some other approaches. Again, I think Australia's been quite leading in some of this, is that things such as cross-sectoral projects that focus on new competencies. And these are often projects that are operating across multiple industries and often focused on a wicked problem or common need that's shared across multiple emerging industries, and usually involves a coordinated approach between different stakeholders, so government, usually industry, but also the skills sector. The former Australian Industry and Skills Committee had a whole range of cross-sector projects that were operating, and we're still seeing activity in some of the sorts of key emerging areas like cybersecurity, supply chains, and digital skills. And this is one way that different industry stakeholders that are facing particular needs, especially as it relates to the job market, to attracting skills, to influencing the types of new training that we want to see, can actually be active and work with a whole range of like-minded stakeholders. I mentioned around leveraging careers and databases. There's some existing databases on jobs and competencies, and they're a good place to obtain information on NQC needs. Examples include Job Outlook and the new Jobs and Skills Atlas from Jobs and Skills Australia, particularly fantastic resources there. Another way that to make a balanced approach to understanding new qualifications and competencies is to undertake stakeholder surveys with what UNESCO often call employer and business membership organisations, or EMBOs. And these are particularly valuable, I think, in understanding things like skills deepening, the extent to which that's happening, say, within individual occupations or within global industry, within an entire industry. These sorts of things, happen quite regularly. Additionally, our own NCVER survey, employee use and views of the VET system, can also provide some valuable insights in terms of how employers, SMEs, large firms use the formal national VET system, and also, the extent to which they're satisfied with what they see. There are other additional approaches that we're starting to see in other countries. In Germany, they have what they call an early detection system through systematic identification of NQC, and they often call them early bird systems, where not only are they undertaking regular skills anticipation using the kind of methods that I've previously mentioned, but also they're kind of plugging in a whole range of other societal trends, changes to the way of working, for instance, the move towards things like hybrid learning and hybrid work, towards consumer preferences, all of the sorts of things that might have an impact on the need for skills and training. So, there's some good activity happening there in Europe. So it's a natural progression from the kind of traditional ways of looking at skills supply and demand, and actually moving toward a more holistic system. But what are some of the challenges of using this data? I mean, firstly, I think, and again, this is not just from an Australian perspective, this was very much taking a global perspective, is clearly the availability, quality and consistency of data, especially the availability of time series. Australia has a pretty good system. We've been collecting national data for a long time, and we've got a reasonably high level of sophistication around these things. But a lot of other countries are kind of in an earlier stage of that. So ensuring that there's time series data, that it's consistent, it's of high quality, it's replicatable, all of those sorts of things are important. I mean, clearly, unexpected shocks to the system, like the COVID-19 pandemic, can actually impact quite significantly the sorts of forecasts that you do, and also, major changes to economic conditions and things such as that can similarly, make a change to the extent to which these things are accurate. I think it's fair to say that they're better at assessing the current situation, and naturally, the further you future cast, the weaker it becomes. But generally, I think, with having systems that have multiple different data types and different ways of looking at these sorts of things just increases the overall accuracy. And I think another one, again, when we're talking about using this closer to the ground, is that it's often some challenges in the process of translating these sorts of analyses into policy, but also practice on the ground, the extent to which the sort of information is valuable to make really quite significant change in terms of things like training products, and also the sorts of focus that providers, for instance, might make in terms of what sorts of courses they're going to focus on. So I've talked I've talked about identification. I mentioned that I wanted to talk about the other two I's, and I'll do that much more quickly. But the next step is, okay, you've identified the sorts of skills that you need through the approaches that I mentioned. How do you actually integrate that ultimately? And the UNESCO work has come up with effectively 4 approaches to this. The first one is what they call cross-cutting approaches. So these are taking competencies that are integrated into all curriculum training. So these are often known as transversal skills. And, examples of that might be, for instance, things like digital skills. Putting aside the importance of, say, digital jobs, pretty much every job requires some level of digital skill these days. So transversally, these sorts of approaches focus on important competencies and how are they integrated across all curriculum and training. Then there's sectoral approaches, so those focus on integrating specialist competencies into one or maybe a few related industries. Then it can be cut by occupational approaches, and these involve integrating occupational specific competencies, and they might actually be in training curriculum or training regulations. So very much taking an occupational approach. Again, it might be in one occupational, it might be in a family of related occupations. And then what UNESCO call as additional modular approaches, which is what some countries, especially in Europe, use, which they call fast response, where optional models can be developed focused on emerging needs. So the cross-cutting approaches, again, I mentioned that they tend to be broadly integrated into all industry sectors. These competencies are relevant to all learners. Again, examples, digital skills, green skills, problem solving, and things such as that. And some have gone really to a real macro level that the Singaporean skills framework, for instance, incorporates certain job-related generic skills across all 6 levels of their qualification system, including things such as knowledge and analysis, application and adaptation, innovation and value creation, ethics and learning to learn. So these things can kind of, to be, integrated at several levels, including at the top level. Some examples of sectoral approaches, ones that are incorporated into individual related industries. Some examples there are the key authority for vocational education in the Basque Country in Spain. Technica have developed what they call innovation hubs that have been focused on a few prospective industries, and they've been addressing special job and skill needs as part of their growth objectives. And these are competencies that are relevant and important to learners in their particular industry sectors only. The occupational approaches, again, those that are incorporated in specific occupational contexts. They're important to learners in specific occupations, and again, occasionally families of related occupations. And there's quite a few examples operating in several European countries, such as Finland, who use occupational clustering approaches for jobs that have relevance across like occupations and things such as that. And additional modular approaches, these are the ones I mentioned that are often developed to use or address local or regional employment needs, and meant to happen more quickly than maybe more traditional ways of thinking about these things. And again, examples in Netherlands and Finland, where they've built systemically a high degree of flexibility into their system to allow for broader-based competencies and to actually reduce some of the hurdles to their implementation in local contexts and things such as that. And then finally, implementation. And there's certain factors that are important in terms of implementation. Quite often, some of the important stuff has happened up front, that we've identified what are the new qualifications and competencies we need. We've kind of integrated them into for instance, a training package environment, etc. But we must remember that there's a final step in all of this, and that really is around ensuring that our training providers and those that are teachers on the ground and the students are actually accepting and can, you know, take advantage of these. And one of the most important things that the UNESCO research has shown is that to ensure that this level of stakeholder is active and that these things work well, is that you need to establish the frame conditions and achieve the buy-in of these stakeholders and ensure that the parameters on the ground for things like structural support are very, very clear. You know, in that way, this establishes confidence in new qualifications and competencies, especially amongst industry, the learners and the broader community. And the other thing that the research shows is that understanding that there is an important step in ensuring that the micro stakeholder, if you want to call them that, the voice of the student and the teacher is important in all of this. If you want to successfully incorporate new qualifications on the ground into the teaching and learning environment, absolutely essential to involve teachers and practitioners in it, but it's also ultimately students who are the ones that are going to be interacting with the training and ultimately benefiting from it. And also ensuring that there's proper support for practitioners in NQC implementation. Another level of that is acceptance and assurance. So these new qualifications and competencies need to be ones that industry and the community accept. They're relevant, they're attractive to learners. We need to understand how they're going to be implemented, how they're going to be updated, how they're going to be rolled out. Australia's got a pretty sophisticated system for handling all that sort of stuff. We need to ensure that there's appropriate quality assurance measures and cross-checks in terms of these sorts of things. And ultimately, one of the outcomes of the research was ensuring that in the ecosystem that you assign who has the final terms in terms of their regulation. Another level is having clear indications of structural support, is that providing supporting funding or supporting systems for stimulating the take-up of NQC and beyond, for instance, things like simple initial piloting stages is absolutely essential. They need to be integrated into wherever possible into the formal structures of the vocational education and training system. And there needs to be adequate investment in both their rollout, their review, and their sustainability. In that way, these sorts of things have got half a chance. And then really finally, one of the most important things that the BUILT project showed is that investment in the professional capacity of the vet practitioner through things like upskilling, through actually providing active support, especially in the implementation of new qualifications and competencies, is absolutely essential. And just an example of one jurisdiction in Canada that's taken this to a really detailed level is in Quebec. They've provided an online portal where practitioners can gain digital access to things like processes and toolbox as part of a comprehensive approach to implementing NQC. And that's done through the Ministry of Education and Sports in Quebec in Canada. So, you know, supporting the practitioner is very important. So we're almost done in terms of the official presentation, and then we can open up for Q&A. But just some final thoughts. I'm certainly not an expert in these sorts of things, but certainly, you know, in undertaking the work with UNESCO and working with partners, there's a few things that I think became clear from our work. Firstly, you know, ensuring that our system, the vet system, is future ready, involves the continual evaluation of information and data, especially labour market data, and also constantly improving the evidence base for the development of new qualifications and competencies. The higher the quality and the more information that we have, the better that we can respond to emerging needs as you know, as they come about due to industry needs and consumer trends and things such as that. Organising and disseminating information and data to assist in training renewal is essential and for consumers to make good choices. And it really ultimately is a role that the macro stakeholders such as government must play, but also as well the meso level stakeholders. So ensuring that the information is there, it's kept current, it's up to date, absolutely essential. Also, additionally, providing a supportive environment for NQC implementation ultimately requires investment and oversight, and is something that those level stakeholders are best placed to provide. So I'm just going to stop sharing and just going to open up the Q&A and see if there's any questions. But thank you very much for listening to me. I see a couple of people I know there, and I'll just try and answer a few questions. I received a question, quite an easy question or a broad question around the Built initiative itself. And at what level of stakeholder is the Built initiative primarily aimed at? I'd answer that by saying that it's very much focused on multiple levels. However, I think the Built project itself was very much around influencing system level change and addressing some of the UNESCO strategic development goals, especially around ensuring inclusive and equitable education, but also lifelong learning and strengthening partnerships. So they're SDGs 4 and 17 respectively. So their focus is very much around influence across all three levels, from the system level through to the influencers, those that play essential roles in terms of making decisions in terms of where we put our effort in terms of industry, but also ultimately those on the ground. But very much the Build initiative was around helping countries to actually think about these sorts of things strategically as they develop. Hopefully that's a helpful answer. Just having a look at a question here. I've got a question from Elaine. Hello, Elaine Butler. I know you well. Elaine and I used to work together at the University of South Australia, and it's good to see you're here at the webinar today. Elaine's got a question around, do you see or can you see the potential connection between this work and Jobs and Skills Australia's current work on developing Australian national skills taxonomy? Absolutely. I think one of the things that Jobs and Skills Australia, and again, I can't speak on their behalf. I think Barney Glover was at the National Press Club today. Barney and his team are in a much better position to be able to answer that question. But what I would say is absolutely is that with the advent of JSA, we're seeing a real maturing of the way that Australia approaches these sorts of things. And certainly we're maintaining an active interest here at NCVER in terms of the work around the national skills taxonomy. And all of those sorts of things are going to ultimately assist us in terms of the kind of way that we actually collect data and the way we report that sort of information. So absolutely, we're going to be very much focused on that. Another question from Damien Sullivan. The Australian data seems very useful for short and medium term needs. However, for longer term shifts which impact choices for apprentices and skills and demand, yeah. So I think the question from Damien was around how do you take into account the fact that a lot of this data tends to get weaker in terms of its predictive ability beyond the kind of immediate. I mean, a good example of this was, some of our earlier models, for instance, had failed to predict the long boom in terms of, the mining boom that we had back 20 or 30 years ago. There are some things that really are very, very difficult to know. I mean, things like economic circumstances, things like, international pandemics and things such as that are always things that are variables that you've got to take into account. But I think what we are seeing is that by increasing the kind of different types of data that we're bringing into these sorts of systems and what have you, just helps us a little bit, in terms of trying to try to better predict these things into the future. But again, as I mentioned in one of my slides, it is really quite a dark science. And, I think trying to predict the needs out to 20 or 30 years is definitely something which is quite challenging. Okay. I've got a question from Shweta Singh. I know Shweta. Hello, Shweta. It's good to see you. Shweta's got a question around any comments on AI integration in VET curriculum. Absolutely, that's a big focus. And again, I don't want to speak out of turn. The Future Skills Organisation, which is one of our important Jobs and Skills Council, has been undertaking a lot of work, which has actually been looking at the potential of AI and how it's going to impact, education and training and employment going forward. They started some of this work in their former guise under the Digital Skills Organisation. And absolutely, AI is going to make a huge difference in terms of not only the world of work, but as you say, in terms of the way we deliver training and things such as that. And I'm aware of the fact that the Future Skills Organisation at the moment is actually got some work underway, which is actually, very much focused on AI. It's another good question from Elaine. I'm not an expert again on this, but Elaine has asked a question around the extent to which this sort of work can assist in harmonisation required between VET and universities, so learning pathways can kind of be aligned and things such as that. I think the answer is yes, it can. The Singaporean example I mentioned is one where they're trying to take an approach which actually kind of looks at all levels of the Singaporean qualifications framework. So trying to understand the sorts of new skills that are expected in the workforce at the various levels and how that would impact ultimately training and education at the different levels of their qualification framework. So again, I'm not an absolute expert on this, but I would have thought definitely it could assist in that. Anne's got a question around, can I clarify skills deepening? What I mean by skills deepening is that quite often within a job, we can see sometimes, quite a lot of change in terms of new skills and things such as that. But quite often, as we become more comfortable with new technologies and the sort, that there actually needs to be the same skill, but it needs to actually be applied at a deeper level. And also, in the kind of industry setting, quite often, you'll have occupations with different levels from, say, technician right through to professional levels. And quite often they will require some skills that will actually deepen as they kind of progress along their trajectory in terms of their overall career. So I'm kind of talking about skills deepening in terms of, the individuals, their work, their actual work, and the kind of skills that they might need. For instance, when they first enter the world of work, maybe at a lower level position, but ultimately as they become more sophisticated, as they get, promotion and things such as that, they might move their way up the career ladder. Hence, they might need some of those sorts of skills, but they're going to be at a deeper level than what it would have been if they were earlier. Karen Halbert's made a really good comment here. I think it's more a comment than a question, and she made a comment here that there needs to be there possibly needs to be greater connections between schools, vocational education, and higher education in supporting students to develop the full range of skills that we might need. And I think absolutely. I think a lot of the successful approaches, certainly those that we've seen operating in the European context, not only involve the full range of social partners, but also very much have representation at the different levels of education. Is that for these sorts of things to be successful, ultimately you need a full education and training system response. And that doesn't just include vocational education and training. If you do that in splendid isolation, these things have got less of a chance of being really, really successful. So actually approaches where you're actually bringing in, general education, primary, secondary, with the technical vocational education system, with higher education, and kind of understanding the connections and transitions and things such as that is a really, really important way of making sure that we have a holistic approach to these sorts of things. So a really, really good comment there. What industries have been identified globally as immediate targets of development? Look, I think quite often, I don't think I can speak globally about that. I think there are some industries that I think are becoming real focus points for pretty much every country as we kind of transition from Industry 4.0, for instance, to Industry 5. They do tend to be those kind of technology related things. I mean, I mentioned earlier things like cybersecurity and things such as that. We just can't get enough of these sorts of people. So clearly we're seeing some of these very strongly technology driven industries that are being set up. Additionally, other ones, around things like electric vehicles, another example. NCVER recently did a bit of research looking at, what's the skills and training impact of, the real rapid growth of electric vehicles, for instance. Other green technologies and things such as that, they're really very much focused either on kind of a new technology or new way of thinking or what have you, have tended to become the industries that people are most focused on. Things like supply chain, logistics, things such as that. And some of that former work that I mentioned that the Australian Industry and Skills Committee itself was overseeing was very much focused on some of those sorts of things. So they're kind of things where they're going to generate new jobs. They're going to require change to existing jobs. And as a result, the focus tends to be on those. So, and of course, they are often country or regionally specific as well, that depending on the nature of, the kind of industry characteristics. Just having a look at a last couple. I think we're just about done here with the questions. Yep, I think I've pretty much covered all of the questions. Oh, okay. There's a question, just a quick question from Adiba Feta. Hello, Adiba. Pleased to meet you. She was very pleased to hear that NCVER has done some work around electric vehicles. It's basically what we call a snapshot publication. So effectively what it does is to take some of the data that we've got, which kind of looks at the extent to which people are starting to move into training which relates to that, and also talks a little bit about trends and things such as that. Absolutely, it's available. It's available on the NCVER website, www.ncver.edu.au, and you should be able to get it there from the, either on the front page or up on the top of the NCVER website. We have something called research, and you can click on there, do a quick search and bring it up. But certainly that one's available, and encourage you to have a bit of a look, because one of the things we're trying to do, I think, is to use the kind of data and research that we've got to kind of focus a little bit on some of these sorts of emerging trends and emerging needs and things such as that. So that would be great. I'm pleased to help you there. I think there's one or two questions that I might have to take a question on notice there, because I'm not a completely expert on some of the sorts of questions that I've got there. But be assured that I will be getting back to everybody, after maybe consulting with a couple of my learned colleagues here. But we're looks like we've pretty much done. It looks like we've pretty much answered all our questions. Again, I hope you found today's webinar useful. We'll probably wind up the questions from now, and really thank you for attending this webinar. A short online evaluation survey will be sent to you shortly via email, and we'd appreciate it if you could take the time to provide feedback, as this will help us to improve your experience next time. And finally, to hear the latest from NCVER, please subscribe to our portal, or follow us on LinkedIn or X, as they call it now, and also Facebook. And really, really thank you for your time here today, and hope you enjoyed your time with us in today's webinar. Thank you.